537. Does that number really mean anything to you? Well, let me put it into a bit more perspective. According to the financial advice site Investopedia, $537 will be able to rent you an apartment. Oh, hold on. An apartment in Manhattan for about 5 days. Interestingly, in 537, that is May of 1937, the Hindenburg blimp crashed. The Golden Gate Bridge was open to the general public, and the Reds beat the Phillies 21-10. However, we're not going to be discussing any of these 537s today. Instead, we will be focusing on the 537 people that decided the future of the world. According to the audience survey responses, every member of my audience is an American citizen, meaning that at one point in their lifetime, they will have the ability to vote. I turned 18 this past March, so a week from today, I will be casting my very first ballot. But that begs the question, does a single vote really matter in the modern political environment? That is a question that the members of my audience have vastly differing views on. Some of you believe that a single vote is monumentally important in shaping the future, while others believe that a single vote really won't matter much in the long run. Today, we'll be examining the question of whether or not a vote matters by examining two very influential votes in our nation's history. The first of those two votes deals directly with those 537 people, the presidential election of 2000. Now, before I get into the actual story itself, I need to share a little bit of backstory. In the United States, we elect a president through the Electoral College. It is a system in which each state is allocated a certain number of electoral votes based on their population. Whichever candidate gets the most votes in that state receives all of the electoral votes for that state. For decades, the number of electoral votes needed to win the presidency has been set at 270. Now, let's take this information and apply it to the presidential election of 2000. In this election, the candidates were former Governor George Bush and former Vice President Al Gore. According to the Bill of Rights Institute, this was an incredibly close presidential election. In fact, even well after the election day on November 7th, we still didn't know who was going to be the next president. At that time, the total electoral votes were Bush 246, Gore 260. What you'll notice from those numbers is neither candidate has the necessary number of votes to become the president. That was because the state of Florida remained undecided. With 25 electoral votes in the balance, whoever won Florida would win the presidency. Now, the first count of the Floridian votes showed that Bush had won by 1,784 votes. But according to the National Constitution Center, that caused an automatic recount in the state of Florida. The recount showed Bush to be ahead by a mere 317 votes. Al Gore asked for another recount in several of the counties. When this final recount was conducted, it showed that Bush had won the state of Florida and thus the presidency by 537 votes. Now, you may be saying, well, that's great, but it still doesn't show that one vote is important. After all, in this instance, there were 537 people. If one person hadn't voted, then Bush would have only won by 536. You're right. And that's why it's time to turn our attention to the second story, in which we will deal directly with the importance of the single vote of an ordinary citizen. This second story today is the annexation of Texas. Texas became the 28th state to join the Union in the year 1845. However, our story actually begins 3 years prior, just outside the small town of Kendallville, Indiana. According to the Longview News Journal, Henry Shoemaker was a farmer working out in his fields when he remembered it was election day and he hadn't voted yet. He quickly rushed into town and went to the polling offices, but when he got there, he realized that none of the ballots contained all of the names of the candidates he wished to vote for. So he did something quite unorthodox. He found the ballots that he wanted, he voted for the candidates that he chose, and then he decided to chop up the ballots with his penknife, including his votes in one other ballot, and folded them up and turned them in to the ballot counters. Well, this was a very unorthodox way to conduct a vote. And because of this, the ballot counters actually at first discounted Shoemaker's ballot. The problem was when it came to counting the votes for the Indiana General Assembly election, there was a perfect tie, 360 to 360. After a great bit of deliberation, the ballot counters decided to include Shoemaker's ballot. That gave the victory to Mr. Madison Marsh by a single vote. All right, fast forward 1 year in time. Madison Marsh is now sitting on the Indiana General Assembly, and it comes time for the Indiana General Assembly to appoint the next senator to the United States Senate from the state of Indiana. They voted 5 times on who should represent the state of Indiana. And in each of those 5 votes, not a single candidate was able to secure the majority vote necessary to become the next senator. Then on the 6th vote, Madison Marsh decided to change his vote. He voted for Edward Hannigan, who ended up winning the seat by that 1 vote. He became the next senator for the state of Indiana. All right, fast forward 2 more years. It's 1845. Finally, the vote is before the Senate of whether or not Texas should become the next state in the Union. As the roll call vote is occurring, it's clear that it's going to be a very close vote. The decisive vote ended up being Edward Hannigan's. The final vote was 27-25 in favor of making Texas the next United State. If a single senator who had voted in favor of annexation had voted against it, it would have gone to a 26-26 tie. Now, normally a tie can be broken by the vice president. However, this was one of the few times in our nation's history in which we didn't have a vice president because the sitting president had died while in office and the vice president had become the president. What this means is that if Edward Hannigan had voted differently, the bill or the proposal would have ended in a 26-26 tie and would have lost by default. So Texas ultimately became a state because of the single vote of Hannigan, who only became a senator because of this single vote of Madison Marsh, who only was sitting on the Indiana General Assembly because of the single vote of Henry Shoemaker. All right, it appears my time's almost up, so allow me to briefly conclude. Maybe you're thinking, yeah, those are incredible stories, but 1 vote still doesn't matter. And perhaps you're right. But if 538 people had thought their vote didn't matter, then we would have had a different president 20 years ago. If a single farmer working out in his fields had decided he needed to tend his grounds instead of going and vote, our nation would look very different today.